You got to love yourself first. Thinking an additional positive thought can move you away from depression, away from self anguish, and then into a place of thriving and flourishing. And so, this willingness to experiment with being a beginner, right? Being new, being a novice, being humble, having humility, I think is a key ingredient to experiencing joy. Or
Welcome to the 1 Million Years of Joy podcast. I'm Dr. Andrea Kerr, your host, and my intention is to inspire you to find more joy in your life through the stories from our guests and the science on joy and purpose. Loretta, welcome. It's such a pleasure to have you with us today.
yay, thanks for having me. I'm always so excited to have good conversations with you.
Likewise, Loretta, your work began with bringing self-care and healing practices to incarcerated women, cancer patients, and those experiencing homelessness. What were some of the most powerful lessons you have learned from those experiences?
Yeah, thank you for reflecting back some of my own story to me. I often tell that story that my introduction to just working, right? My introduction to the career world was not just through self care, but particularly through yoga and meditation. And gosh, I learned a lot about that, especially recognizing that I was so young. When I started doing that work, I was in my early 20s working with a local nonprofit. I would say some of the biggest takeaways from those experiences is how similar we all are, right? How similar people are. I think coming in to doing that work, whether it was teaching yoga at a hospital or teaching meditation at a prison, inherently, I think I came to the work feeling really separated and different from these people. I would even go as far to say that I felt like there was almost, in some cases, privilege and a hierarchy, that I was able to go into these spaces and offer these modalities. But the more that I did it, the more that I really got to know people, the more that I connected with these individuals and their experiences, the more I really understood the power of human spirit and how similar and how alike all of us really are. And although I would be in rooms with people and I'd be having a very different life experience than they were, right? I'm teaching yoga and they're incarcerated, or I'm teaching yoga and they're battling and recovering from cancer. Although we had very different life paths and very different life experiences, the joy that I found was recognizing actually where we are connected, where we have commonalities, where we did have a similar experience, or we had something in common, or we liked something similar, or we had a similar dream, something that we similarly wanted for ourselves. And that was probably one of the things that really kept me going, because that work could be really difficult to go in and to offer healing to people that were in a lot of pain. But the thing that kept me going back was remembering that we're connected more than we typically think.
How beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing. And since you mentioned that at the core, your focus was on yoga and meditation, I'm curious if you could share with our listeners how those practices shaped the way you experienced and looked at life.
This is a great question. Before I found yoga and meditation, I felt like I was following a pretty typical path for a young person going to school and pursuing education in America. Um, Graduated high school. It was strongly encouraged that I went to college. And if I'm being really honest, I didn't have much of an interest, but was just following the path. And in undergrad, I studied psychology. And even then, right, even in my late teens, early 20s, I felt like I was just kind of in this box of like, if you're going to study this degree, then these are the things that you will likely do. And I think at first some of those things were interesting to me, like, oh, I could become a psychologist, or I could help with mental health challenges. Like all of that was interesting to me. But the more I studied, the more I honestly just felt anxious of just having to follow this beat and having to follow instructions, so to speak. I remember looking at my peers who were also studying psychology and asking them, like, what do you think you're going to do with your work? And it was always just kind of like, yeah, I think I'll end up just doing this thing that we're supposed to do because we have this degree. So then cue access to yoga and access to meditation and these wellness practices. It just it opened up my world so much. I think first and foremost, access to these practices helped me to understand me even more. I again felt like I was just going through the motions, but then when I started meditating regularly and going to yoga classes regularly, I was more in tune with how I was really feeling about my life experiences. Like I could not just go and do my classes and go and get my degree, but I could actually understand how it felt for me to be going through the process of higher education. So I had heightened emotional awareness, heightened self awareness, a deeper connection to myself. That's probably the biggest thing I took away from those practices. But through the context of growing my career and getting into leadership, I think the elements of yoga and meditation also afforded me a curiosity of how do I integrate those practices into my studies. If I'm a person who's getting a psychology degree and that's going to open up opportunities for me to work in mental health spaces, well, then what does it then mean for me to be a person that has mindfulness practices and a meditation practice and access to yoga to then integrate those teachings into these spaces where I would typically be working as a mental health professional or as someone with a psychology degree? So I think, in short, um, yoga and meditation really exposed me to really knowing myself and connecting with myself and being honest with myself about how I feel about myself and the world that I'm in and the work that I do. And it then encouraged me to bring that sense of knowing this, to bring that sense of truth seeking into the work that I would end up doing.
Wonderful. You have shared in the past that moving across the country and cultivating a sense of self love are among your proudest achievements. How did those experiences contribute to the joy that you find in your work today?
Moving across the country, I would say it wasn't an easy decision, but it was one of those decisions in my life that really felt right. And I wish I had some better language to add texture to the feeling that moving across the country brought me. Again, it wasn't easy. I would even argue that it was maybe a little bit inconvenient. Maybe it wasn't the best timed, it wasn't the best planned. But again, there was something in me that knew that moving from East Coast to West Coast, moving to California, was absolutely the right decision. And it's so interesting that you bring this up because I was just reflecting on some journal entries from around the time that I was moving. And what I was writing at the time was that I was just so looking forward to a life that was more easeful, that was more joyful, that was more expansive. I think I recognize, having grown up and lived in the same place for 25 years, I was a little bit bored. I think I was a little bit lost. And I think, again, I was finding myself in this cycle of you are now this age, and now this is the next thing that you need to be doing. You need to be finding a partner and getting a job that pays more. And you need to be focusing on maybe buying a house in the next couple of years. And so, again, my sights on California was another opportunity for me to really have more agency and to be more expansive in the life that I live and really just have access to more cultural opportunities and just try on a couple of different, I would say, pairs of sunglasses to see what would life feel like? What would life be like if I just did it differently and had a different experience and lived in a different state or just did something out of the norm? And once I got to California, I mean, it felt like a very extended vacation at first. But now that I'm heading into my ninth year of living out here, I realized that that right feeling that I had, right, when I decided that I was moving to California, even though it was kind of a disorganized plan, I realized the right feeling that I had was that I wanted to seek a life that was more interesting and, again, more expansive and just afforded me more opportunity to live. Not that living in New Jersey wasn't expansive and there was an opportunity, but I think deep within me, I just wanted to break out of the box and just experiment with what could life be like if I just, again, did something a little bit different. And again, now that I've been out here almost 10 years and I can look in the rearview mirror, I really see that getting out here just opened me up to so many opportunities. And when it comes, like bringing it back to the self-love piece, I think on a surface level, like moving to California was an act of self-love because I don't really love winter. So I wanted to live in Southern California and be in a place where it was sunny most of the time. And Southern California is far more progressive than the parts of New Jersey that I lived in. So I just felt like I feel like I have more access to community that really understands me. I've been able to really express my identity more freely, or I should say, I've been able to express multiple parts of my identities more freely in California. So it's really given me more life to live out here, and that's been an act of self love. But I think another layer of self love that I would add here is that choosing to move to California, or even choosing to become a yoga teacher, or choosing to pursue a career that was a bit taboo, bringing self care and yoga and meditation into a professional world. I think those were all moments of self love for me because they were moments of agency. They were moments of, again, getting out of the box and recognizing that I can live a fulfilling life and I can have an impact in this world if I go out and align myself with the things that I actually value.
And since we've spoken about the importance of self-love, if someone really is struggling with this concept and this idea, what advice would you give them? Where can someone start in order to experience more self-love? Because that is truly the foundation to be able to love other individuals that may cross our paths and actually to bring more love into this world.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I'm going to quote RuPaul here. He says all the time, you got to love yourself first, right? If you're going to love someone, or if you don't love yourself, how on earth can you love anybody else? And so, your question, right? Where do you begin? Where do you start? My mind is percolating with a couple of ideas. I think it's kind of bouncing around in two different places. The place that my mind first went is, well, you got to talk to yourself. I think some of my strongest self love practices originated in a willingness to actually have a conversation with myself. And of course, we all have inner dialogue. Of course, we all have self talk. Of course, sometimes we have inner dialogue that isn't kind, right? Sometimes we have, or we all have our self critics. We all have saboteurs. We all have, versions of ourselves or voices in our head that maybe aren't always the most helpful. So when I say talking to yourself, I don't mean just listening to your own self critic or your own voice in your head. I mean, actually engaging with the voices in your head, actually engaging with the thoughts that come up, and specifically the thoughts that you have about yourself. I think the work is actually listening to how you talk about yourself, how you think about yourself, and making intentional time to really listen to that and to understand that and to challenge that. Some of the ways that I do that, right, if we're going to put it into practice, is I have a daily journal practice where all the stuff that's percolating in my mind, I write about it. I will even be honest, more recently, I've been in a season of grief, and very surprisingly and interestingly, my grief somehow activated my self critic. And this kind of goes into the second piece of advice, which is about asking for help from people to help you better understand yourself and find self love. But anyways, I recognized that my self critic was present, and my journal practice for about a week was like writing love notes to my self critic and asking her questions and trying to understand, like, hey, what's going on? Why are you emerging during these times? Why has loss and grief activated you? Is there something that you feel like you're not getting? Where is this all coming from? So, yeah, I think having really honest conversations with yourself is important. Like I said, I have a journal practice. Something that I like to do is if I'm on a hike or I'm walking my dog, I also reflect by like recording voice memos, so like literally talking to myself out loud and then going back and listening to those voice memos so that I can hear what I've said, hear how I talk about myself, hear how I talk to myself. So those are all really good practices. But like I mentioned, I think there's also an element here of leaning into community. So bringing it back to my self critic, I hadn't even realized that my self critic was present until my partner, my therapist, and my mentor were all like, "Hey, like you're talking about yourself in a way that you don't typically do. Like what's going on?" So I think it's again important to invite yourself into the conversations with yourself so that you can really understand who you are, what's going on, and how you can work on you. But sometimes we can't even see ourselves that clearly unless we have the mirrors in front of us to help reflect to us what we're feeling. And those mirrors are often people in our community, our families, our loved ones, maybe even sometimes the people we work with. So, a two-parter there, right? Talk to yourself, but also get honest feedback from the people that love you about what they might be seeing and how you might, again, lean into yourself more.
Yes, wonderful advice. And when you're talking about the monologue in our heads or this inner chatter, this brings me to some research I was looking at recently that was sharing that if you have one negative thought for one positive thought, those are the typical characteristics of individuals that are actually depressed or have a high level of anxiety. If you have two positive thoughts for one negative thought, you're going to be languishing. It's almost like there's something missing in your life, right? You're
Mm,
not necessarily at your peak in terms of positive emotions. But if you're able to actually have three positive inner thoughts for every negative thoughts that you have, that is where you're flourishing. This is where you can achieve greater success. You can achieve a greater level of contentment and joy. And I thought that was very, very interesting because
mm.
often we dismiss and don't necessarily pay as much attention to all the chatter that we have in our heads. But I think if we are paying more attention to it, as you're suggesting, and engaging in that dialogue, we can actually just completely bring more self-love and lower the judgment that often happens and that sadly leads to so much mental health issues and distress for many individuals, sadly.
I really appreciate that research. It reminds me of just kind of like the concept of behavior change, that it's actually pretty simple. Not that it's easy, right? But it is as simple as I just need to be thinking more positive thoughts. And to know that thinking an additional positive thought can move you away from depression, away from self anguish, and then into a place of thriving and flourishing, it just motivates me to say, okay, well, then how can I just think more positive thoughts? Again, it's not always easy and it definitely takes practice and it definitely takes time. And like I mentioned, I'm sure it takes community. It takes having people to reflect back to you when you're having those negative thoughts or when you've said something out loud that isn't terribly positive. But I think just the motivation alone of recognizing if I think more positively, I will have a more positive life is exciting.
Yes. So this actually brings me to the topic of joy. And if there would be a recipe for living more joyfully, what do you believe would be the three main ingredients?
Oh, this is a fun question. And I'm working with some imagery in my mind because I like to cook. Hmm. I'm going to play with this question a little bit. I might not exactly have three ingredients. I might talk more about methodology.
Okay.
What immediately came to mind is kind of like the method of boiling something or sauteing something. And that image came to mind because when you boil something or saute something, there's actually a reduction, right? If you boil water for too long, the water turns to steam and the water disappears. When you're sauteing something, if it's vegetables or something like that, you know that they'll start to wilt and they'll lose some of their fluid as you cook them. And the reason I'm bringing up this metaphor and these examples is because what's been really relevant for me, again, especially having gone through a recent season of grief, is that accessing joy sometimes requires having to surrender, having to let go, having to shift and change, and to be open to transformation. When I think about some of the most joyous moments of my life, like moving to California or starting my own company or going to grad school, it didn't come without sacrifice. It didn't come without a need to change, to transform, to change my form. I think the times where I was not experiencing joy were the times where I was gripping and I was holding on and I was reluctant to change. And so, if I could add maybe one ingredient that is absolutely necessary for joy, maybe again, it's not an agreement or an ingredient, rather, it's you have to be open to change. You have to be open to shifting and transforming.
Wonderful. Are there any other ingredients that you think are essential, or you
Okay,
just want
yeah,
to
yeah. Let
focus
me think
on
about some
one
ingredients.
single one that is just like, the foundation?
Yeah. Oh, this is such a fun question. Okay. So the methodology is that yes, you have to be able to change. You have to be open to change. Joy is accessible when you allow yourself to surrender and be open to change. But the ingredients that are also present there that I think make joy more whole and full is connection. I've experienced joy by myself. Like it's not impossible to be alone and experience joy, but oftentimes those joyous moments were in relation to other people. I love to travel. I've traveled alone quite a bit. And again, I've been alone. I mean, I was just thinking about the time that we met for the first time last year in Europe. I went to Europe by myself and I had a couple of adventures where I was alone and it was joyous. But then I also think about the other people, even strangers that I met along the way that made that whole day or the whole trip a joyous experience, right? The people that I interacted with at the store or strangers that I talked to at the restaurant. So I would say just making sure that you're connected is a critical element of experiencing joy. I think another element is a piece of humility or remembering the importance of being a novice. I think a lot of the moments where I felt joyous, again, moving across the country, going back to school, it was kind of like those first time moments. Like I've never really done this before, or I've never really done this in this way. And so this willingness to experiment with being a beginner, right? Being new, being a novice, being humble, having humility, I think is a key ingredient to experiencing joy or really allowing yourself to receive the joy that comes with doing something new. And then one more ingredient. I would say something in between the feeling of fear and excitement. I think they're two sides of the same coin. There have been things that have brought me joy that have been scary, that have been fearful, like starting a business, right? It's a huge risk. But on the other side of taking the risk, taking the leap of faith, moving through the fear was then this excitement of like, oh my God, I'm doing this thing. And because I then did the fearful thing that brought me excitement, I also experienced joy in that process.
Amazing. And for someone listening to our conversation today who may feel exhausted or uninspired by what they do, what's one thing that you would recommend that they start doing more in order to bring more joy on their journey?
I think the advice I would give is to lean into and get curious about the resistance. The moments of my life before I chose to do something risky that ultimately brought me joy, the moments leading up to those opportunities, I think there was some resistance. For example, I had wanted to move to California forever. I mean, probably since I was a teenager. And again, as I was reading through old journal entries, I reminded myself that someone had told me that I had been talking about moving to California since high school. But then I didn't do it until I was 25, which isn't a terribly long time, but it's enough time, especially for a young person, to be thinking about something and having not done it. And I'm sure I didn't do it for a while because I hadn't saved enough money, or, the timing wasn't right. But I can also say with certainty that there was at least a couple of times, a couple of years in there where I knew that I wanted to do it, but I resisted it and then just kind of ignored the resistance, right? I came up with some kind of excuse as to why I couldn't do it. And then one day I asked myself about the resistance. What is up with this part of me that keeps telling myself no, that keeps telling myself I can't, that keeps telling myself I'm too tired, I don't have enough resources, it's not going to work out, right? Where is this self-critic coming from? And what would it look like to actually sit that part of me down, sit down the resistance, and ask it some powerful questions about what is actually possible? And the parts of us that resist often do it for good reason, right? Our minds want to keep us healthy. Our mind's job is to keep us safe, to keep us alive. And sometimes the mind resists things because it doesn't want us to take the risks. But I think something we can start to be curious about, especially if we're stuck and we're doing work that we don't like to do, or we're in a situation that's not aligned with who we really are and who we want to be, then we need to bring with us the part of us that is resistant. And again, ask some powerful questions about why that might be. And how do we persuade them or make the more resistant part of ourselves more comfortable and open to doing something different, while honoring that the reason we resist, again, is to keep us safe. But also, how do we bring them in and say, hey, what would it look like to take a risk, to pursue joy by getting uncomfortable, by being a novice and trying something new for the first time?
And that's what actually life is all about, is embracing the uncertainty, continuously pursuing new challenges and adventures, because that's what makes life thrilling at the end of the day. And in fact, research is even showing that we regret more the things we did not do, that maybe
Mm-hmm.
have been in our mind and we were thinking about, dreaming about, but we did not find the courage to actually pursue them, rather than regretting, let's just say, pursuing a path and realizing that it didn't bring us success or the contentment we were thinking about. So it's really, really interesting how, at the end of the day, I think if we could all embrace the possibilities that may exist from bringing forward that courage, we're actually going to feel greater joy and fulfillment than if we actually just step into our fear that will ultimately take away all these new possibilities that could emerge in our lives as a result of the courage that we may bring forward. So, really happy about everything you have shared and talking about stepping into the unknown with your venture and your own company and the Do Good Leadership Collective. I was wondering if you can just tell us some of the highlights or the highest level of fulfillment that journey has brought to you since you've decided to pursue that path.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, entrepreneurship has been quite the journey. I consider myself to be an entrepreneur, of course, but I frequently talk about entrepreneurship more as like a practice. And I don't think it's something that I'll ever perfect. I would love to master it to some degree, but mastering and mastery means practice. So I thoroughly enjoy the art of practicing entrepreneurship. There's a lot to be learned there. But the company I founded as I became an entrepreneur is Do Good Leadership Collective. And we are a coaching and consulting firm that helps social impact professionals do good and be well. And I think my favorite thing, I mean, there's so many things I love about starting a business. I mean, there's a lot that I don't love, right? It can be really challenging. It can be really difficult, especially when the economy changes, right? Like there's so much to learn and so much to work through. But there's a lot to love about creating something of your own and experimenting with it and practicing entrepreneurship. I love the opportunities it's given me to be creative. It's been learning curve after learning curve after learning curve. And it's so fun when I talk to peers and I say something, in the realm of like business acumen. And they're like, oh my God, I didn't realize like you knew all this stuff about website SEO or taxes. And I'm like, well, I had to learn it because of it. I'm an entrepreneur. So the learning curves have been really fun, difficult sometimes to get through in the moment, but really fun on the other side. But the number one thing that stands out, I would say, is the self healing that has come with creating a business that represents what I needed in a younger version of myself. So, again, the work that we do is primarily focused on social impact professionals. We work with a lot of nonprofit organizations and their leaders. And ultimately, what we offer is coaching and consulting and events, retreats, workshops, ultimately like leadership development opportunities that help people really see their humanity, get grounded in their well-being, get grounded in their self-confidence and their self-love, and then learn how to lead from that place. And that's so significant for me because that's what I needed when I first started my nonprofit career. I needed leaders that valued those principles when I first started my nonprofit career. We talk about burnout so frequently, especially in the social impact and nonprofit sector. And I don't think there's necessarily one right way to fix burnout, but the approach that we take to solving burnout is that we need to help people know themselves and love themselves and advocate for themselves and lead from a place of not only feeling confident in their skills, but confident in their own self-worth, in their own self-esteem. And again, I needed that. I needed a leader. I needed bosses 15 years ago, 10 years ago to instill that in me. It would have saved me a lot of pain. It would have saved me a lot of grief in my career if I trusted myself and loved myself and was more connected with myself as I was entering the workforce. And so it really is the privilege of my life to have built a brand and built a company that centers those values and centers those principles and teaches leaders of all ages, of all genders, of all backgrounds that centering well-being matters. It's really important, especially if you do social impact and nonprofit work. It's a key part of sustaining yourself. It's a key part of building your endurance and your resilience in this work. And to offer that work and to be getting feedback from people that are receiving that work saying like, this has been so helpful, this is transforming my life, this has had such a huge impact on how I see myself and how I see my work in the sector. It just makes me so happy to have built something from, I would say, my own pain, to have kind of turned that pain on its head and turned it into something for good for others has been probably the most joyous and exciting thing.
Amazing. And if there would be one piece of advice that you could give to your younger self, what would it be?
Oh goodness, a lot of pieces of advice. It's kind of vague, but I would just tell my younger self that you're doing great. You're doing great. I think I realize now that the people who we are in the moment is because of who we've been previously. And we just continue to grow and we just continue to build. And all the mistakes that we make aren't for nothing, right? We learn from those mistakes. And I think if I could flash back to a moment in time where my self-critic was really loud and I was beating myself up about something and just feeling really down and out, I would just hug that version of me and say, I know it feels crappy, but this is a good mistake. You're doing great. You're doing great. Keep going.
Amazing. And Laura, any final words of wisdom that you wish to share with our audience as it relates to joy, resilience, and well being?
I'm going to offer something that was recently offered to me in case it resonates. My mentor shared this with me the other day. We were having a really great conversation about the state of the world. And admittedly, I was feeling a bit panicked and overwhelmed and just not really sure what to do, what decisions to make. And he said something really simple, but I've been repeating it daily as a mantra, which is do what you need so that you can do what you want. And it's been really helpful, especially these last few weeks, to ground myself in recognizing that I can make important decisions around what needs to be done. When we're living with uncertainty, when times are hard, when times are scary, it can feel really debilitating. It can feel paralyzing to make decisions. And I just want to offer folks, just ground yourself in what needs to be done and know that when you do what needs to be done, you create space to eventually do what you really want to do. So do what you need so that you can do what you want.
Beautiful. Loretta, it's been such a pleasure to speak with you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for letting me share some of my story and share some of my wisdom.